you need to understand the severity, but you need to focus on the action, the solutions, and building knowledge towards those solutions, because that's what gets people motivated. That's what brings people together. That's what instills action. And so I put a lot of time and energy into bringing together communities that have diverse skill sets, that have different experiences, different approaches, so we can all sort of work together toward that positive outcome.
This episode is brought to you in part by our sponsor, Tidal Influence, a Californian ecological consulting firm who proudly supports environmental education and all of the diverse conservation efforts that Pelicanus works to highlight. Visit their website at tidalinfluence.com to learn more about what they do to conserve our coastal resources and how you can get involved. On today's Conservation Conversations episode, we talk with Dr. Kelton McMahon. Dr. McMahon is an associate professor in biological oceanography and runs the Ocean Ecogeochemistry Lab at the University of Rhode Island Graduate School of Oceanography. Now, we really dive into the science on this one, but I promise it all comes together perfectly. So enjoy our conversation with Dr. McMahon. Dr. McMahon, thank you so much for joining us. We're super excited to have you, and you do a lot of crazy stuff. So we're really happy to do a deep dive into all the stuff you do. So please introduce yourself. Tell us all who you are and what you do.
Yeah, hi. My name is Dr. Kelton McMahon. I'm an associate professor at the University of Rhode Island's Graduate School of Oceanography. On there, I run the Ocean Ecogeochemistry Lab. So we're interested in understanding how energy moves through ocean food webs and how things like climate and human environment interactions alter those relationships.
So ecogeochemistry, I had never heard of it before when I looked at your website. So I'm just like, that just seems like too many prefixes for one word. So can you just give us like and maybe you can talk about some like examples of like what some projects
Sure.
you get to. But yeah, what is it that ecogeochemistry means?
Yeah, so ecogeochemistry was a word I actually coined, I don't know, a decade ago. And it was my response to what do you do? And trying to sort of succinctly share that we use geochemistry, so we use stable isotope tracers to understand ecological questions. And so lots of people have heard of biogeochemistry, which is sort of cycling of nutrients. And we wanted to develop a word that sort of moved past just purely cycling of nutrients to thinking more broadly about the ecological connections that are made as energy, organic matter moves through systems. And so my career has been spent developing geochemical tracers or tools to answer biological, ecological, environmental questions. So for example, I'm sure you've heard the age-old adage, you are what you eat. So we actually incorporate chemical cues of the food we eat and the places we live in our tissues as we live and grow. And my group can use those chemical cues to reconstruct something about your past. So where did you live? What were you eating? How did you turn food into biomass? And with some additional context, we can tell a lot about how systems are built, how they function, how resilient or adaptive they are, all through this lens of food. And we use chemical tracers as our insight into how food moves through systems.
It's such a complex system in the ocean. I'm assuming that it's really hard to track, that you have to pick something. And so, wow, okay. I don't even know where to go with that because I'm too stupid.
I can give you maybe a juxtaposition, a comparison, and it might help. So, scientists, naturalists, ecologists for centuries have been interested in trying to understand who eats whom in the ocean, right? Or on land, anywhere. Understanding, your food source tells you things about individual growth, survival, reproduction, how much energy you have to grow and get bigger or to reproduce and make the next generation. Uh, it Food shapes things like the ecological and evolutionary trajectory of whole populations. Think classic cases of Darwin's finches or MacArthur's warblers, this idea that birds have evolved different shaped beaks to access different types of food resources. I've got a big crushing beak because I eat large hard seeds. I've got a really long slender beak because I go deep into holes to find grubs deep inside, you know. And so this shapes the evolution of species. It shapes how different species interact. MacArthur's warbler is a great example where warblers spend different places, or they forage in different places within a tree so that they can all coexist, so that they're no longer fighting for the same resources. All of those are shaped around food. So people have been really interested in food for centuries. Uh, Traditionally, how ecologists have done that is things like direct observation, right? Spending many, many hours out watching uh, to look at interactions. They might look at stomach contents. So either you squeeze a penguin and make it throw up, and you can look at what's inside its stomach, or you catch a fish and you wonder what that fish ate. So you cut open its stomach and you can see what that fish was eating. These are all really useful snapshots of who's eating whom, who's interacting, who are the prey, who are the predators, where you're getting your food. The challenge is those tend to be only snapshots, right? If you ask me, oh, like what did I eat for breakfast this morning? I'd say Canadian bacon and eggs, and you're like, ah, yes, he's uh, a Canadian bacivore, right? And that's what he eats. But if you had asked me yesterday or the day before, I was actually in Hong Kong. And so I was eating soup dumplings, right? So I was eating something completely different. So the snapshot of what's in my stomach at any given moment changes, and it changes day to day. It changes throughout your life. It changes depending on where you are. Am I in Rhode Island? Am I in Southern California? I might be eating tacos. If I'm in Hong Kong, I might be eating noodles. So scientists have tried to develop additional tools to explore what things are eating. And one of the tools that we use is called stable isotopes. And so this is a chemical cue into food. And so isotopes, for those who maybe don't think about it on a day-to-day, minute-to-minute basis like I do, are just atoms of the same element. So think carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, the things that make up living organisms, the air we breathe, the water we drink. Uh, the Each of those atoms of carbon, for instance, has the same chemistry. So carbon acts like carbon, acts like carbon, but there are different versions of carbon that weigh slightly different amounts. And that mass, that weight, is really important because it changes how that carbon moves through a system. So we can actually look at the ratio of the heavy version of carbon to the light version. And that ratio changes in predictable ways as we eat things. So when I eat my noodles, the ratio of heavy to light carbon in the noodle gets incorporated into my tissue with a modification that's predictable. And so I can go back and I can look at the ratio in my tissue and I can reconstruct what I was eating. For example, as my hair grows, it records a signal of what I've been eating throughout the life of my hair. So if I plucked a hair and I cut it up into a sequence, I can look at that carbon isotope ratio at different points along that hair, and I can tell you when I was in Hong Kong versus when I was in Rhode Island because I've changed my diet. And so that chemical cue incorporates really powerful information about our food in ways that we wouldn't get by trying to look at stomach contents alone.
It's almost like the tree rings of of your own
Exactly.
life. It's like that's so crazy. I guess my question from that great explanation that reminds me of senior year chemistry, just remembering like, oh yeah,
Perfect.
isotopes. Yeah. It. So Do you study these? Well, first off, I told somebody what we were talking about, and they're like, "Is that like eDNA?" I'm like, "No, kinda, but no." It's like it's a similar type thing, but it's a completely different side of the coin.
Hmm.
But it, I guess my question is, when you are looking at this, are you looking at long-term changes from like climate change, coastal development, or can you look more specifically at like, hey, there was an oil spill, so we can check how the flora, fauna, or whatever in that area was has been affected?
Yeah, and the answer is yes.
Yeah.
It's all of those, and that's part of the reason why I really love this tool set and this approach. Um, in part, when thinking about the age old question, like, what do you want to do when you grow up? I don't think I could ever really focus in on any one species or ecosystem. Uh, I really like traveling and exploring new places and asking all sorts of different questions. And so I specialize in an approach, this sort of development of these isotope tools, because it allows me to ask all of those questions. So I've got students in my lab that are working on very applied modern food web questions, whether that's here in coastal Rhode Island, thinking about how climate influences availability of crab and lobsters and iconic fisheries in southern New England, and trying to understand whether populations being fished in the near shore and the offshore are actually connected and should be managed together, or are separate and should be managed apart. I've got students interested in really long term questions using deep sea corals as biological archives of the past. We have corals that live, thousands of years, and they lay down rings just like a tree trunk. And so we've been able to use those corals to reconstruct multiple millennia of environmental change. We've been working in Antarctica on penguins as canaries in the coal mine for climactic and human environment interaction change, thinking about how, you know, changes in Southern Ocean climate over the last 7 to 8,000 years suddenly intersect with major human pressures like historic whaling in the 1900s to reshape Southern Ocean food webs. And so we've been actually doing paleontological excavations of sediments in the Antarctic Peninsula to recover bones and eggshells and feathers that go back thousands of years. And I use this isotope chemistry to reconstruct what those penguins were eating, where they were living, to see how climate and human environment interactions alter Southern Ocean food webs. So it can be as near term as changes in metabolic processes as fish eats its prey, and thinking about how that changes its glycolytic versus TCA cycle in its metabolic pathways, to as big picture as ocean basin scale productivity and over the last 10,000 years. And so at no point do I ever get bored or stationary, because this sort of tool can be used for kind of anything you want.
One, you mentioned the meteorite work, which I find fascinating. But you also mentioned Antarctica and penguins, and I think that's kind of like everyone loves them because they're
Yeah.
happy feet, and the charismatic megafauna thing, and all that. So how often do you get to go to Antarctica? And I guess talk a little bit. I mean, you talked about the canary in the coal mine, but I guess I'm trying to get to like a bigger picture of how it all fits together. Do you even know how it all fits together? You have like 6, 7 different projects. Like how do you ever have like a one through line other than the
Uh, I,
isotopes?
I wish it was just 6 or 7.
Yeah, right.
Um, yeah, no, I always joke that I'm sort of the consummate like salesman. I'm always sort of telling stories that connect what seem like really disparate projects, places, ideas. I actually had to do this exercise as I was, starting to apply for faculty positions, where I was like, humans love to categorize, right? They like to put everything into boxes because that's how we process all of the complex information around us. And I was like, if I'm going to sell the work I do, I need to be able to put it into a box, even if I don't think it actually fits in a box. And so I've spent a lot of time coming up with the threads that weave all of these projects together. And honestly, it comes down to understanding how energy and food moves through systems in order to understand how those systems were built, how they function, how resilient and adaptive they are to change. And with that broad brush, characterization, I can fit a lot of very unique projects, questions, collaborations, inside that story. And so I use that to my advantage to build a lot of really powerful and wonderful relationships with systems and people all around the world. Uh, and the funny thing is, actually, there's a really good origin story to this union, which was I was a sophomore in undergrad, and I was taking a marine ecology course with Will Ambrose, who ended up becoming my undergrad honors advisor. And I was also taking a geology course on stable isotopes. I came in with a lot of math and chemistry background into undergrad, so I got to skip ahead a fair bit. I did organic chemistry my first year. So I got to move ahead relatively quickly, which was really fun. And both of those courses each had a semester-long project. And I'm, again, the consummate salesman. I managed to convince Bev Johnson, my geology professor, and Will Ambrose, my marine ecology professor, to let me do one project for both courses, where I used isotopes that I was learning about in my geo class to ask some really cool questions about the movement and diet of fish in marshes in Maine, which connected to my marine ecology class. And apparently I did a good job pitching this idea because they both agreed. And I ended up publishing that paper. So that was my first ever publication, was as a sophomore undergrad from a class project that I pitched for two different courses combined into one. And that really showed me just how powerful this approach of using, organic chemistry and sort of these geological or, geotracers to answer ecology questions. And it really instilled in me the value of these sort of interdisciplinary approaches, where you're thinking across disciplinary lines to ask questions that are way bigger than any one field could hold alone. And so that ended up being like a common theme throughout my career, is this idea of what if we actually blend disciplines together? What if we actually talk to people in health science or engineering, theology, all of these topics that maybe don't seem intricately connected on the surface, but when you dig into it, how people view their relationships with each other, whether that's culture, whether that's religion, influences how they relate to their environment. That impacts their health, their livelihoods, the economy. It impacts the ecological health of the environment. That then feeds back to provide goods and services to people. And so I really like these sorts of approaches because it allows me to touch on all of these different disciplines and topics and bring them together to answer questions that no one field could do alone.
So we're in the middle of a series about coastal resiliency.
Yep.
We've talked to some folks in Southern California, and that's why we're talking today, is because a friend of mine said, I've got a great person who does exactly this. And so looking through your website, you kind of talked a lot about what you do, and I feel like one of the best terms I've found, I never really heard of this term specifically, was this food web architecture. how it all
Hmm.
fits together. And well, I have two questions. Like, one, how what are we seeing in terms of impacts from climate change? And I know that could be, we said dozens of projects, so that could be specific to each area. But then also, how does it relate to coastal resiliency? Because as you just kind of mentioned, these coastal habitats are, a lot of our food comes from there. A lot of our storm protection comes from there. A lot of these areas are so important to these communities, but also not even just the communities. But then also, how does it all relate into like the coastal resiliency? I mean, we can get more into that about the communities and indigenous knowledge and all those things a little bit later too.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, I'm all about hope because I think, there's no need to do there's no motivation and no need to do anything if it's all hopeless. And so, a lot of the work I do is looking for solutions. I think we often dwell on the problems, and absolutely, we need to understand the severity of the impacts around us. But if that's all we know, then there's no path forward. And so lots of my work really focuses on positive solutions to major, sort of existential threats and challenges. Uh, yeah, so I can talk, I can give a couple of different examples that sort of link some of those topics together. One really cool example is work that my recent master's student Lindsay Agvent was doing here on climate adaptive fisheries. So this is actually work in partnership with commercial fishing groups as well as state agencies like the Rhode Island Department of Environmental Management and NOAA. So this really brought together, practitioners, policymakers, and scientists interested in developing healthy, sustainable fisheries in southern New England. So the sort of backstory to this is southern New England has been and I had an iconic fishery in lobster for a century or more. Much of our fishing infrastructure, our economy is built around lobster fishing. Lobster are cold water species, so as waters have been warming over the last, certainly over the last half century, the lobster population has been migrating north. So now the center of the American lobster population is far further north. In fact, lobster in the Gulf of Maine are booming right now. There's a really vibrant, healthy lobster population in the Gulf of Maine. The lobster population in southern New England has crashed for a number of reasons. Some of that's overharvest. A lot of that is climate and the redistribution of lobster north. Some of its warming has introduced diseases that have impacted lobster. So there are a number of different sort of synergistic impacts. But the end of that story is that lobster in southern New England is really been a pretty decimated fishery recently. And with that becomes loss of jobs, livelihoods for fishers in southern New England. And so people are looking for climate adaptive solutions. They're looking for hope. And it turns out that inside lobster pots might be that hope. For decades, lobster fishers have been catching Jonah crab. It's a large cancer crab. It's related to Dungeness crab, if you're familiar on the West Coast. Big, large claws, super tasty. So we have Dungeness's sister over here called Jonah crab. They're a cosmopolitan distributed species. You find them from Florida all the way up to Canada. So they are perfectly happy with the changing water temperatures, and they actually love going in lobster pots. The lobster fishing industry was so lucrative that Jonah crab were just tossed back as bycatch for years. But it turns out that they could be a climate adaptive solution. So we can use the same infrastructure, the same lobster boats, the same lobster pots, but now with a different target. And so there's been a significant increase in catch of Jonah crab, which could potentially sort of save a lot of the careers and that decapod crustacean market by switching to Jonah crab. The challenge is we don't actually know that much about Jonah crab. They haven't been a target species for very long. And as a result, we haven't spent a lot of time studying them, their biology, their ecology. So, in fact, Jonah crab are managed under lobster management areas. So, we use the lobster management zones from Rhode Island out to the continental shelf break to manage a completely different species, a completely different genus, right? And so you can imagine that creates a disconnect between the biology and ecology of the species and its management, which then potentially jeopardizes the sustainability of that relationship. And so my student, Lindsay Agvent, did a really cool project where she used isotopes to create what we call an isoscape or an isotope landscape. She generated maps of the spatial distribution of isotopes. So think about a road map. And so you've got all the different patterns on that road map. And as crabs live and feed in particular places, they incorporate that isotopic value into their tissue. So they've got a little address book and they're writing down where they've been throughout their life. Right now, we've got fishing in nearshore state waters and offshore federal waters, and they're fished separately. What we've noticed is that the crabs that are caught offshore are larger on average than the ones inshore, which generated this hypothesis that maybe as crabs are growing up, they're migrating offshore. And if that's true, then you're actually connecting two different fishing areas through migration of that species. So what happens in the nearshore impacts the population offshore and vice versa. So if that's true, we actually need to have better communication of fishing practice between the inshore and offshore. And so she was able to use isotopes in different tissues, which record different time periods of that crab's life, to show that there is, in fact, connection between the inshore and offshore. And so we need fishing managers to take heed of what's happening in each of these locations. We can't treat them as completely separate. And so here's a way that we can use isotopes, this sort of chemical tracer, to reconstruct something about the movement of crabs between different fishing areas to better inform our sort of species specific management so we can capitalize on this potentially climate adaptive fishery that could save the jobs, the income, the livelihood of an entire sort of iconic and historic fishing community in southern Rhode Island that's been really put out as lobster have migrated north.
That's wild. That so all I can think about when you just told that story was like, one, that was going to be my next question, is like, how do you connect doing research on isotopes to the local communities? But that was a perfect example of how that works. And so that's why one of the reasons why I love conservation is, like, obviously we like animals, we like the ocean, and it's fun to go look at these things. But it was like you took that natural ability in math, and I love that people like you are good at OChem, because I couldn't even think about it. I was like, nope, not even going to do that. I'm going to pick a major where I don't have to do OChem. So the fact that there's people out like that can do it and they're good at it and that can use that for their career is like awesome. I'm glad you guys exist. That's why I love this is so much, is like one, like you said, you found this method and then you can connect it to basically saving this historic, iconic fishery that, when you think of Maine, you think of that Northeast, you think of like lobster rolls, you think of lobster, and so being able to preserve that, but just in a little bit different way, just by looking at isotopes and crabs, it's so crazy to me. That's as cool as it gets to me,
I could give you another example that that in some ways very different, in some ways shares some common truths. So actually, our connection, your and my connection through Sarah Godfrey is a great example. Uh, I've been working with Sarah for the past couple of years as part of a nonprofit called One People, One Reef, which was established well before my time. But Nicole Crane, who's in Santa Cruz, California, at Cabrillo College, uh, formed a partnership with community members in Ulithi Atoll, which is one of the outer islands. It's actually the fourth largest atoll in the world. It's outer islands of Yap State in the Federated States of Micronesia. And so she had been doing some work in that region. Community members in Ulithi Atoll had noticed changes in their reef system and invited Nicole in to do some work. They really valued her community-centered approach to science and management. And so Nicole and community members, John Wilmot Jr., who we call Magul, the two of them and colleagues formed this nonprofit called One People, One Reef to help community members understand and build really locally adaptive and locally guided management of reef systems in this atoll. And so this is a very traditionally governed system. So they don't have grocery stores. They don't have large, department stores, things like that. They get, almost 100% of their protein from subsistence harvest on reef systems. And so their lives and livelihoods are intricately connected to these reefs. And I was brought in, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago now, for my interest in food and food webs to help link some of the changes in sociocultural dynamics. So the influence of westernized fishing approaches to this traditionally very community-based fishing practice. So, people in Ulithi have been stewarding their natural environment on these coral reef systems for well over 1,000 years. But in recent decades, there's been this transition, the introduction of things like motorized boats, spear guns, which are a very individual fishing practice, into a community that has been traditionally very communal, operating large net systems, outrigger canoes that require multiple people and communication across families to operate. You introduce a spear gun where a single person can operate it. They don't need to talk to their neighbor and get help. The concern is that may have broken down some of the communication, some of the sociocultural context of fishing and shifted it. And so we were brought in to sort of ask some of the questions about how sociocultural dynamics have changed with the implementation of some of these individualized fishing approaches like spear guns. How does that impact the health of the reef? And then how does that feed back, goods and services like food from the reef back to people? We took a really community-centered approach to this. So, much of this work was listening, it's asking questions and listening. And it's years of building that relationship, that trust, and really guiding our research questions around the needs, the voices, the lived experiences of those community members. Because not only does that make for better science, but it also makes sure that the science is built to serve the communities for which that science is being done. And so we have ethnographers and human geographers working in collaboration with, people working on genetics and, metagenomes, to people working on isotopes, to people doing photomosaic transects of reefs. And we're combining all of that information together through the lens of local, place-based knowledge to help build out a more holistic understanding of these reefs and the people connected to them. And so you can see some really powerful, impacts, some direct management change, like changing how people fish for large parrotfish, which play a disproportionately important role in the health of reefs. They manage macroalgal biomass. Algae and coral have been in battle for space on coral reefs for millions of years. And without a healthy herbivore, so algal eating community led by things like large parrotfish, macroalgae wins that battle. And that reshapes the health of coral reefs, the biodiversity. And so spear guns are potentially really problematic there because you can go in and you can target the largest of those herbivorous fishes like parrotfish and surgeonfish. They also tend to be really tasty, and they're the easiest to catch. And so a spear gun could alter the health of that whole ecosystem without proper management. And so we work with those communities to create those connections and share that information and help to build that within the community's already really powerful knowledge of how those systems work. And together you can actually reshape management through a community perspective rather than a sort of outside Western influence. And it creates for a much more long lasting, healthy relationship as well.
But I do want to talk about, you kind of already mentioned a little bit the origins of how you brought the Ecogeochemistry lab together, and at least in your head to begin with. But what was it that got you at least interested in the ocean to begin with? Like, what was it about? Did you grow up near the ocean, or did you grow up? Sometimes people grow up in the Midwest and they're like, I got to get to the ocean.
No, I'm the former. My mom jokes that I came out of the womb with a microscope in my hand. I've been fascinated by the ocean and just how the world works since I was a teeny tiny kid. I grew up in a little fishing village in coastal Connecticut, that has a long storied history of fishing. And so it really was instilled in me early on the value of the ocean for lives and livelihoods. I spent a lot of time at the town dock catching crabs and exploring under the dock and looking for treasures in the ocean. I also was really fortunate, my parents really valued travel, and largely to see different communities, different ways of living, different ways to connect with the environment around us. So I don't know if we ever took a trip to a city. I think all of our trips were spent really trying to understand communities that are really intricately connected with environment around them. We spent time living with a nomadic bush community in Eastern Africa. We spent time living with communities in the headwaters of the Amazon, backpacking through Alaska. We spent a lot of time traveling, and that was really like sort of important for my sort of understanding of different cultures, different ways of life, different sort of lived experiences, and particularly thinking about how they connect to nature and wildlife. And so I attribute a lot of that to my parents, both in terms of the privilege that we have, the resources and time, as well as the interest. Both my parents were really into science, and even right now, I have a 5-year-old and a 2-year-old, and my parents live about 45 minutes away, and they come up every week. And my daughters are out rolling logs over. I just got a video from this weekend where my 5-year-old found a snake, and she said, "Granny, can you catch that for me?" And Granny says, "Absolutely, I can." And it's really cute. And so it's been really special seeing my parents' influence on me, then passing it down to my kids as well. So it's been something that I've been fascinated by since I was a little kid.
Especially when it comes to your lab where you brought all these different fields together. Like, was there an inspiration for that? Was there someone who was like kind of already done that, where you're like, oh, I really liked what they did, and so I can kind of take my own direction with that? Or was it just kind of like the general, just growing up in the ocean?
Yeah, that's a complex question. So I mean, motivation, I think for me personally, has always been lived experience. It's been able to travel and just see just how important our connection with the world around us, whether it's the ocean, land, forest. I actually teach an undergraduate grand challenge course here at URI, where I take students from basically every major we have at URI, and we talk about how intricately connected we are to the ocean. How do we positively and negatively impact the ocean? How does the ocean positively and negatively impact us? And so, my motivation and both in my research and my teaching growing up has been to just better connect people with the world around them. Where does your food come from? Where does the air you breathe come from? uh, where does the medicine you take come from? 60% of all the drugs we have in market now come from a marine natural product origin, right? So, or just a natural product origin, terrestrial or marine. So that's sort of been the motivation. And then the how I translate that has been creating a lab that I think looks like the diverse voices and perspectives that I'd like to see in science. I appreciate that, I'm a white dude from Connecticut, and I grew up in a family that had a lot of privilege. We had a lot of privilege to travel, privilege for education. I was able to spend a lot of time just exploring the world, right? And so, in part, I've designed a lab that I think uh, better reflects the diversity of perspectives, lived experience, goals. I don't need to make a lab that looks just like me and has my upbringing, because no offense, but people like me have plenty of privilege already. And I think that I'd really like to make sure that, the next generation of scientists really appreciates the diversity of approach, whether that's, the interdisciplinary nature of our work, the, diversity of goals, right? I've got students who come from long histories of fishing. I've got students who came from art backgrounds that think about how we visualize and share science and science stories. I've got students that have backgrounds in things like engineering, right? How do you build uh, better instrumentation that is inspired by nature and the world around us? So I really like sort of capitalizing on the diversity of experience, voice, goals, approaches, because I think it creates new insight that we couldn't have otherwise.
We focus everything on hope and optimism, and it's not just greenwashing like, oh, I'm sure it'll be fine. It's more
Yeah.
of like, the possibilism idea of, the Michael Soule quote is like, how does that translate into your day to day, into your, study design, and, bringing on different grad students and different projects you want to do? Like, how does that optimism, possibilism theme kind of like guide you, if it does?
Yeah, I mean, it guides kind of all of our decisions, because a lot of the work we do is centered around climate and climate change, which can be a pretty depressing topic. For example, the first semester I ever taught this grand challenge, human environment interactions course. I had one lecture towards the beginning about climate change, because I think it's one of the most pressing challenges humans have probably ever faced. And so it's like, I think everybody, whether you're an art major, a theology major, a business major, a nursing major, I think everybody should have some understanding. So I had a lecture about, climate change and our climate's warming, and, here are all the sea level rise and everything that comes from it. And I left that lecture and I was like, that was so depressing. And I could just see it in everyone's face. It was like they were depressed, I was depressed. And I left just feeling like deflated, like unmotivated. And I thought, I can't do that again. I can't just tell everybody how awful it is and then move on. And so I've now built out 4 lectures. The first one is somewhat doom and gloom because I do think it's really important to understand the severity of what's going on around us. If it's not urgent and if it's not severe, there's very little motivation to do something. But if it's urgent, severe, and terminal, there's also not a lot of motivation to do anything. And so the next 3 lectures are all about climate hope, which is not a topic we talk very much about, but it's climate mitigation strategies, it's climate adaptation strategies. We have some in-class activities where we actually show that we have all of the tools we need right now. You don't need some magic silver bullet to be invented sometime in the future to positively impact future climate change. We have everything we need right now. What we need is buy-in, and what we need is action, right? And so that is a far better message than everything is hopeless. And so, all of our sort of study design, down to who we work with, is built around this idea that you need to understand the severity, but you need to focus on the action, the solutions, and building knowledge towards those solutions, because that's what gets people motivated. That's what brings people together. That's what instills action. That's where I want to be in this space. And so I put a lot of time and energy into bringing together communities that have diverse skill sets, that have different experiences, different approaches, so we can all sort of work together toward that positive outcome.
What is your advice for if people are looking for something to do? Again, they're hearing the news, everything's terrible. What do you say to those kinds of people when there's like, I don't know, I'm just stuck. What do I do?
Yeah. I mean, my first advice to everybody is to vote. Everybody's voice matters. And so I think voting is one of the most important things that we can do as a community to share our goals and our priorities. And regardless of how you vote, I would never tell anybody how to vote, but I would tell everybody to vote. I think that is probably the single biggest impact that we as individuals have. Beyond that, I think there are a whole host of different ways that we can get involved. Some of that is as simple as, joining organizations, right? Being on newsletters, listening to podcasts like this, educating ourselves. I think education is probably the second most important thing we can do. Maybe I'll flip that. Maybe educate yourself first and then vote. I think, learning about what's going on around us, not only the impacts, and we hear a lot about those, but also the positives, right? Like there are so many great grassroots organizations, NGOs, community organizations, whether it's, your local food pantry or your beach cleanup, whatever it might be. There are lots of great ways to help. And I think those actions have major co-benefits. If you do a beach cleanup, absolutely, cleaning up that beach is helpful. But perhaps what's even more helpful is the visual of people caring, right? When somebody's on a beach and they see people going in, picking it up, that translates, that impacts those people. It has cascading impacts, right? And so it might not seem like a big deal to pick up some trash from the beach as you're walking home to your car. But people notice that, just like they notice if you throw your trash on the ground. If you throw your trash on the ground, somebody else sees that and they feel emboldened to do the same. The positive hope message is just as contagious, if not more contagious. So education, local action, pulling that all together, and voting in people that share your views on the world as you want to see it, I think are all really powerful ways to do things.
Kelton, thank you so much. This was a fantastic conversation, and I really appreciate you taking these pretty hardcore science topics and ideas that I'm too stupid to understand And what I do understand is the impacts that they have both on the local ecosystems, but also the communities, as you mentioned. So thank you so much for sharing that. And yeah, we're just so excited to be able to talk to you and learn more about this. And it's just been great. So thank you so much.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me. And thanks for doing this sort of work. I think this kind of science communication is so pivotal to creating an informed community. And so I love these kind of interactions, and I really appreciate your role in that.
Thank you again to Dr. McMahon for taking the time to talk with us. Please check out the Ecogeochemistry Lab's website and find Kelton on social media at Ocean Eco Geochem Lab if you want to follow their work. Host and producer is Austin Parker. Music was provided by a Picture Book Studio. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe if you want to help. Thanks again. We'll talk to you next time.